Recently, I was going through Microcenter, and I came across this laptop right here. It was on sale for $79.99, which I thought was a really good price for a laptop, so I got it. And today, we will see how much a laptop you can get for $79.99. I'm going to be testing this laptop out normally, and I'm going to be pushing it to its limits to see what its limits are. Without further ado, let's dive straight in. The box it comes in is really generic. It's just a box with some printing on it. But the box doesn't have to be very good, it just has to be a box. But I don't care what the box looks like, let's just take the laptop out of the box and see how the laptop works, shall we? Right out of the box, the laptop doesn't look too special, it just looks like a very generic laptop, which is fine, because it's only $80. It doesn't appear to have an Ethernet port, but it has one USB 3.1 port and one USB 2.0 port, a micro HDMI port, a headphone jack, an SD card slot, and also a SIM card slot as well. Now, opening the laptop is actually rather weird and hard. So it's a very stiff screen, and there's not really a spot where you can grab the screen with your fingers. So you instead have to get your fingernails under the screen and the keyboard to be able to lift up. And it's also very stiff. I don't know if I already mentioned that. And because it's stiff, you feel like you're going to end up breaking something. At least I do. Luckily you don't, but it still does feel like it. So, my first impressions of the keyboard is not that good, at least before turning the laptop on and using it. The keyboard little keycaps do not feel very good. They feel like they are super thin plastic and weigh nothing, in a way. They feel like they will just kind of break off, if you know what I mean. And also, they are not very pleasant to touch. They just don't have that good of a feel, and they sound quite hollow as well. Turning the laptop on is quite simple, which it should be, because, well, you're turning the laptop on. But it is actually different than any other laptop I've ever used, and I have roughly 15-ish laptops, granted they are all super old. On this laptop, the power button is on the keyboard, and you just don't go over and quickly press the power button down and let go. Instead, you have to hold it down for a few seconds for it to actually turn on. Another interesting quirk the laptop has is where the power and aux jack are. So the power port or the power plug is the exact same size as the aux jack, and they are in the exact same spot as well, just on opposite sides of the laptop. The first time I plugged the laptop in, I didn't read which one was the aux jack and which one was the DC power. I just plugged it into the right one without thinking. Luckily, it didn't break anything or fry anything because I was plugging it into the aux jack, not the power port. Right there, I was digging around in the BIOS, trying to see if there's any performance modes or if there's any overclocking I might be able to do on this, and it looks like there is a somewhat limited but possible overclock I actually can do in the BIOS of this computer. Though, I am not going to be going over and adjusting anything in the BIOS just yet, because I want to see how the laptop performs right out of the box. But later on, you better bet, I'm going to start switching around some switches in there to see what I can do. Turning the laptop on brought me to the Windows setup. It only took around 15 minutes to get through the setup, not too bad. There was nothing different compared to a normal Windows 10 setup. Once I got to the desktop, I was assuming there would be a bunch of apps installed, like McAfee for example, but no, there really isn't. There's nothing installed besides a flat out just Windows 10 installation. Nothing extra. So that is a good sign probably. You don't always get that luxury with a $1,000 laptop, and I'm getting it with an $80 one, so that's nice. Also, sorry for the screen glare, I fixed it later on in the video. So, it is time to go over the specs of this laptop. It has a 4-core Intel Celeron N3450 CPU at 1.1 GHz, with a boost going up to around 2.1 GHz. 4 GB of, from what I can tell, non-upgradable DDR3 RAM at 1600 MHz. Wi-Fi that only supports 2G connections, not 5G connections, and also Intel HD 500 graphics. My laptop must have been sitting on the shelf for a long time, over a year. The reason why is when I got it, it was missing the news feature that was added in early 2021 in Windows 10. So that means I had over a year of updates to go through to get Windows 10 fully up to date, which inevitably took a long time on this hardware. While Windows updates were updating Windows, I thought, you know, this is a new laptop, you must be able to actually handle doing more than one thing at once. And I was sort of correct. It was able to go and download a web browser, which was Google Chrome, with relative ease. It was somewhat slow, the CPU was pegged at 100% the entire time, but it did actually do it. Unlike the computer you saw in my last video, where I paired an RTX 3060 with a 1-core, 1-thread CPU. That did not handle nearly as well as this. The reason why is this CPU is several times faster, and also this CPU has 4 cores instead of 1 core, which helps it out a lot. Once all of the Windows updates were done, I decided to try out Cinebench R23. And while Cinebench R23 ran, I decided to put the laptop on a wattage meter so I could see how many watts the laptop is using. And it was appearing to be using between 9 and 11 watts the entire time, so it is a quite low powered laptop. And it got a score of 467, which is not that good actually. It's about the same as the Cinebench R23 score from my old laptop, which is from late 2008, and it gets a score of roughly 420. Nice. But it's still not that much faster than that, and that is over a decade older. So these 4 cores are definitely on the slower end. That score made me wonder, how fast can I actually make this laptop? So I immediately jumped right back into the BIOS after running the Cinebench test to see what I can do. In the BIOS, there is a power limit setting, and stock it is set to 6 watts, and I didn't really like that 6 watt maximum. So what I did was I raised the 6 watts up to unlimited amount of watts to see what the CPU can do if it is not power limited. Though when I was doing that, it was hitting around 85 degrees Celsius, and it was throttling itself down to around 1.3 gigahertz, which is not that good. It was going slower than when I didn't touch it. So then I was digging around in the BIOS even more, and I found a temperature limit, and I disabled the temperature limit to see how hot it will actually get, or will it ever stop getting hotter, and how hot and fast would it even run. Well, it actually ran pretty decent. I got a Cinebench score of 700 and something. I forgot what the score is, it was a long time ago. And a 700 score is a lot better than 400, so it's almost double the speed. Though the issue here was, it was running at roughly 105 degrees Celsius, and when it got any hotter, which was inevitably gonna happen, it would go over and power itself off so it doesn't turn itself into a molten piece of metal. After a bit of tinkering, I came up with a better solution. So my solution is going over and limiting the power to 9 watts. If I limit it to 9 watts, it won't quite overheat. It will sometimes still get up to around 97 to 100 degrees Celsius, but most of the time it's around 85, so it's not going to be having much of an issue here. It did slightly impact performance though. It went from being 2.2 gigahertz under load to 1.8 gigahertz being under load, but it didn't really impact the Cinebench score that much. It was still getting a score of 702, which is definitely a lot better than the 450 or 60-ish it had stock. It's time to try to get into some games and see how this computer games. So the first game I am checking out is Minecraft Java 1.18.1 with the sodium mod. Just in the menu, it is struggling to reach 30 frames per second, which probably is not a good thing because the menu of this game is not particularly intensive. The performance in a world, it surprises me. Yes, it took a long time to load into a world, and loading in any chunks takes a long time, though it does actually run quite good if you aren't loading in any chunks. It gets roughly 30 frames per second. Yes, 30 is not great, but for an $80 laptop that you can buy new, I gotta say it's pretty decent, at least to me. Though if you want to load in any chunks, it will quickly drop down to around 5 to 10 frames per second until all the new chunks loads in. So it's just barely playable. It is playable, just not the best experience. Also, I was playing 8 chunks render distance. I was curious what would happen if I set the resolution down to 800 by 600. Would it run worse? Would it run better? Well, actually, surprisingly, somehow it's running better on a lower resolution. Even though the graphics chip is not actually maxed out normally, it was close, and now it is still close, but I'm getting better frame rates, so that's something. Because now it's getting between 40 and 60 frames per second instead of 20 and 30. The next game up on the list is Minecraft Bedrock on the absolute lowest settings besides Beautiful Skies. The reason I have Beautiful Skies enabled is because it doesn't appear to impact the frame rate that much, and it looks a ton better, at least in the sky, with Beautiful Skies turned on. Once I loaded into a world, the game was running really good. It was actually able to take all of the 4 cores and use them, and the game was getting 60 frames per second average. It wasn't even really dipping that much. Yes, sometimes it might dip down to like 50, but it's still really good. It was running so good, I actually went over and raised the render distance up to 12 chunks, and it still was running quite nicely. It was lagging a little bit more times, but it was sitting roughly around 60 frames per second most of the time, and it wasn't even stuttering that badly either. You know, occasionally it might stutter a slight bit, but it's not bad at all. It's perfectly playable. Chunk loading is rather slow, but that is a good thing, because it is preferring frame rate over loading in chunks and making the game run like a PowerPoint presentation, which is awesome, so you can actually play the game and not have to worry about your eyes melting. Then I decided to try out some 720p OBS recording Minecraft, and it actually was doing it with relative ease. I was using the graphics chip to encode, yes, but it still was running the game at roughly, give or take, 30 frames per second, and it was also running it quite smooth. Though the temperatures were rather warm, they were hovering between 90 and 99 degrees Celsius most of the time, though the CPU was at 100% the entire time, and the video came out nice and smooth. Then I decided to play some Skywars on the CubeCraft server while recording, and it was working as well, though it was a bit laggier than on a single player world. My assumption was just because it has more effects going on, and I was getting around 25 to 30 frames per second most of the time. The next game up on the list is BeamNG Drive, and I played the game on a 720p, or basically the native resolution of the screen, and I also played it on the lowest possible settings, and it was getting an average of 7 to 10 frames per second, or basically pretty much unplayable. So I tried dropping the resolution down to 800 by 600, hoping that might save the gaming experience and make it better, but no, I was just getting 15 frames per second then. Yes, I know it was a somewhat smooth 15 frames per second, but 15 frames per second is not really good at all for a game like BeamNG Drive. It'd be fine for solitaire, but definitely not for this game. Then I lowered the resolution down to 480p, and the game was running just very slightly better. It was getting around 16 frames per second this time instead of 15, so yeah, I'm a gamer. But no, that still is not very good. The graphics chip is not maxed out either, so I think it is the CPU on this part that is actually making the game not run very good. At least that's what I thought, until I hopped onto the grid map. Then the CPU usage went way down, which is what I was expecting, because the grid map is a lot simpler, though the graphics card is still sitting at around 70% usage, and I'm still getting around the same FPS. So I guess the drivers for this Intel HD 500 might not be that good. I don't know. It seems like it should have ran better here, but it wasn't. The next game up on the list is CSGO on the absolute lowest settings and 800 by 600 resolution, and it was getting a somewhat okay 20 to 30 frames per second. Not not great for CSGO, not even nearly good. You want over 100 for that game usually, but still though, it is running it better than on the last video when I showed you an RTX 3060 and a 1-core 1-thread CPU computer. And once again, the graphics card / chip is not at 100% usage, so either the drivers are not very good or the CPU is holding it back. I think the CPU is holding it back in this one because the CPU is often hitting around 100% usage. But one way or another, I'm surprised that the CPU isn't able to play the game faster. The reason why is I'm using a multi-core rendering. Even though this computer has 4 slow cores, alright, they're only like 1.5 GHz to 1.8 GHz, I'd assume if, CSGO is set onto multi-core rendering, it should be able to play, better if it's using all 4 cores, but I guess not. I thought this was a light game, but it doesn't appear to be that light, though I am also playing this on an incredibly weak laptop. But one way or another though, it doesn't matter what's holding what back, it doesn't perform that good in CSGO. But if you're a casual player and you don't mind the frame rates dropping down into the upper teens, this would be just fine for you. Though, do keep in mind you are mostly going to be under 30 frames per second the entire time. The next game up on the list is New World. Yes, the new game that came out recently from Amazon, and it runs interesting. So, it goes over and maxes both the graphics card out and the CPU out on the absolute lowest settings at 600p. Though at the same time, it is rare it gets above 3 frames per second. It usually sits between 0 and 2, so it is just basically completely unplayable. There's not really much you can do about that. But to give this little computer credit, it is running the game better than I was expecting. The reason why is my i7 3770K, yes K, overclocked to around 4.4 GHz cannot run this game at more than 30 frames per second in the exact same spot. Yes, I know the CPU is quite old, but at the same time though, it is still a very plunky CPU. It's not that slow. And another CPU I have sitting around, which is a Core 2 Quad, it cannot run that area with more than 20 frames per second. It bounces between 7 and 20. So that is a really intensive area of that game. And that is also a really intensive game. The next game up on the list is Roblox Arsenal at 720p, or basically the resolution of the screen. And it ran at roughly 30 to 40 frames per second. And that is actually worse than I was expecting, because it's Roblox, okay? Roblox is a very old game, if I'm not mistaken it's from 2006, and I'd assume it would get more frame rate than that, but no, just 30 to 40. Granted, this is one of the more intensive Roblox games out there, but the game is perfectly playable if you don't mind that 30 to 40 frames per second average. The next game up on the list is Muck. I was expecting this game to run absolutely fine, to be honest. I really was. I was expecting it to be getting, 60 frames per second, 120, no issue. But no, at 720p it was getting 15. Not due to the CPU, due to the graphics card this time, and yeah, I'm actually really surprised about that. Then I tried the game at 800 by 600, and that actually doubled the frame rate. It went from 15 frames per second to 30, so yeah, it's pretty much perfectly playable at 800 by 600. 480p gave another 10 frames per second, so it was getting around 40 to 45, so that is even bigger of a jump. Granted, of course it's a bigger jump because I'm turning the resolution down, so the FPS would go up. At 400 by 300 resolution, or 300p, the game was also running a lot better. It was getting between 50 and 60 frames per second, with dips down to around 45. Then I tried the game at 200p. I was thinking it would get better frame rate, but at this point it's just held back by the CPU, so it ran exactly the same as before, though with a lot worse visuals. And I know somebody is going to be asking, how long does the battery last? Well, that is a really hard question to answer because it depends on multiple things. What's the power, mode set to on Windows? What are you doing? Are you sitting there just on the desktop for several hours, or are you gaming, or are you doing both? Well, that's the hard thing to answer. So I decided to try it out on a normal test. When I say a normal test, I mean no gaming, simply just web browsing, playing back YouTube videos, and occasionally getting in some Discord calls. Granted, keep in mind, when I'm in a Discord call, the CPU is around 90 to 100% usage. Under my test, the laptop lasted 5 hours and 51 minutes and 56 seconds, which I gotta say, that is not quite as much as I was expecting, but that is still a really solid battery life, especially if you're sitting there on, let's just say, the train going between cities. It probably won't be 5 hours before you get a chance to plug it in. So that's not bad, and even if it is longer than 5 hours, you can always put the laptop on battery saver, or just don't get into Discord calls, because getting in Discord calls drained the battery really fast. So, the next test I have for this laptop is, can I edit videos? Well, to be exact, can I lightly edit videos? And the answer to that is yes. Now, I've actually edited this entire video on this laptop, and it is actually holding up rather decently. Yes, it is a bit sluggish, and if I get multiple lines of video going at the same time, then it starts losing a bunch of frames. But at the same time though, I mean, I pretty much flawlessly edited this entire video. Now, exporting videos does take quite a while on here. It takes around 2 hours to export a 20-minute 4K 30 frames per second video. Though it does export the video with no problems, it just takes about an hour or two longer than my Core 2 Quad. So, what are my thoughts on this laptop? Well, I find the laptop quite nice for the price. Yes, $80 for a laptop is quite a lot that only can play this much. Though, the thing is, this is new, not used, so it does come with somewhat of a warranty. Granted, at least this warranty is only 15 days. I don't know if the manufacturer has a longer warranty or not, but at least from Microcenter it is 15 days. Now, this would be a very nice laptop to give to someone who might be older, who just goes on a Gmail, okay? This laptop will fare them very, very well for many years. Unless they drop it, of course. Then, there's also the can it game part. Well, the answer to that is sort of. If you, for example, only play Minecraft Bedrock, and only play Roblox, and maybe Solitaire, this laptop will be perfect for you. If you're trying to play some games like Elden Rings or Cyberpunk 2077, don't even bother with this laptop. You are not going to have a good time unless you want to play at 7p resolution at 3 frames per second. I'm just going to go over my complaints real quick about the laptop. So, complaint number 1, the keyboard is not that good. When I say not that good, I mean it's the worst keyboard I ever used. Sometimes the buttons don't even register when I press them. Complaint number 2, the screen is actually very, very stiffly stuck down when you close it. You have to stick your fingernail in and actually lift the entire screen up from the keyboard, and also hold the keyboard down with another hand. It's quite hard, but at least, okay, it's not hard, but it's kind of harder than it should be to open up a screen. My third small complaint is there is no cooling for the CPU, literally. So yes, there is a copper heatsink. The thing is, there's no fans. Okay, I get it, cost cutting, but there's not even a vent on the bottom of the laptop for any air to get in. Besides, through the speaker vents, which are basically on the complete opposite side of the laptop from the heatsink. So, the CPU does run rather hot. Like, if you go and play in the BIOS, it's gonna get so hot it shuts itself off so it doesn't melt itself. Either way, those are quite minor complaints for the price of the laptop. I'm curious, what do you think of the laptop? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? What's your favorite part of the laptop? What's your least favorite part? I'm just curious to see what your opinions on the laptop are. Either way, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.